Putin's red lines harden, no peace without border change. Let me take you back to June 14, 2024. That was the day Vladimir Putin stood before a room of Russian military commanders and foreign policy officials in Moscow and delivered a speech that should have sent shockwaves through Western capitals. The mainstream media, of course, buried it under headlines about NATO exercises in the Baltics and Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian oil refineries. But if you were listening closely, and if you understand how the Kremlin communicates, you would have heard something far more: a fundamental hardening of Russia's position on the war in Ukraine. Putin wasn't just drawing a line in the sand. He was pouring concrete. I've spent the better part of 4 decades studying Russian military doctrine, Soviet strategy, and the way Moscow thinks about war and diplomacy. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and written books on the subject. And what I heard in that speech wasn't bluster. It was a Russia will not accept peace in Ukraine unless its territorial gains are recognized. Full stop. No negotiations, no ceasefires, no face-saving off-ramps unless the West concedes that Crimea, Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia are now Russian. And if you think that's just posturing, you haven't been paying attention to how this war has unfolded. The problem is, most people haven't been paying attention. They've been fed a steady diet of narratives, some well-intentioned, others deliberately misleading, that paint this conflict as a simple morality-plucky Ukraine, the victim of unprovoked aggression, standing up to a tyrannical Russia with the help of a benevolent West. The official story goes something like: Russia launched an illegal invasion in 2022, Ukraine has fought heroically, and with enough Western weapons and resolve, Kiev can push Moscow back to the 1991 borders. The war is winnable, the argument goes, if only the West stays the course. President Biden has said it. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has said it. Even some of the more hawkish voices in Congress have said it. And the polling suggests that a majority of Americans, at least for now, believe it. But there's a problem with this narrative. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Let's start with the facts. Russia has not been defeated. Far from it. Despite suffering heavy losses, estimates range from 120,000 to 300,000 casualties, depending on who you ask. Moscow has adapted. It has mobilized its defense industry, secured arms supplies from Iran and North Korea, and methodically ground down Ukrainian forces in a war of attrition. The much-touted Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 failed spectacularly, with Kiev losing tens of thousands of troops and billions in Western equipment for minimal territorial gains. Meanwhile, Russia has taken control of nearly 20% of Ukraine's pre-2014 territory, including some of its most economically vital regions. The front lines have barely moved in over a year, and Ukrainian manpower is dwindling. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40, and recruitment is so desperate that Kiev is considering lowering the conscription age to 25. Then there's the economic reality. Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, defying Western sanctions. Its military production has surged, with artillery shell output now exceeding that of the US and Europe combined. Meanwhile, Ukraine's economy is in freefall, shrinking by nearly 30% in 2022 and another 5% in 2023. The country is entirely dependent on Western aid just to keep the lights on, and that aid is increasingly uncertain. The US Congress has stalled on further funding, and Europe's commitment is wavering. Even if the money comes through, it's not clear how long Ukraine can sustain this fight. So why, then, does the West keep insisting that Ukraine can win? Why does the Biden administration keep pushing the line that Russia must be defeated, that Putin must be humiliated, that Ukraine must be restored to its pre-2014 borders? The answer, I'm afraid, has less to do with Ukraine and more to do with the broader geopolitical struggle between the US and its rivals. Here's what's really going on. The war in Ukraine was never just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. For the past 3 decades, the United States has operated as the world's sole superpower, enforcing a rules-based system that, in theory, benefits liberal democracies. But that system is under threat. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. And the global south, countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, are increasingly refusing to pick sides. The war in Ukraine is the first major test of whether the US can still dictate the terms of global security. If Russia wins, even a partial victory, it sends a message to the rest of the West's dominance is fading. If the US and NATO can't stop a regional power like Russia from redrawing borders in Europe, what does that say about their ability to contain China in the Pacific? That's why the Biden administration has framed this war as an existential struggle. It's not just about Ukraine's sovereignty. It's about American credibility. And that's why they've dug in their heels. They can't afford to lose. But here's the they can't afford to win either, not in the way they've defined victory. Let me be clear. I'm not defending Putin. I'm not saying Russia's invasion was justified. But I am saying that the West's approach to this war has been dangerously naive. We've treated it like a chess match, where if we just move the right pieces, we can checkmate Putin. But war isn't chess. It's a brutal, messy, unpredictable contest of wills. And right now, Russia's will is stronger than the West's. Putin has made it abundantly clear that he will not accept a negotiated settlement unless his territorial gains are recognized. That's not a negotiating position. That's a red line. And if the West refuses to acknowledge it, this war will drag on indefinitely with catastrophic consequences for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world. So what happens next? Let's break it down. First, the military reality. Ukraine is running out of men. Russia is not. Kiev's much-vaunted mobilization law has been a disaster, with reports of widespread draft dodging and corruption. Meanwhile, Russia has quietly mobilized over 300,000 additional troops since 2022, and it's still recruiting. The Russian military has also adapted its tactics. Gone are the days of reckless frontal assaults. Now, they're using small, highly trained units to probe Ukrainian defenses, supported by overwhelming artillery and drone strikes. They're not trying to take territory quickly. They're grinding Ukraine down. Second, the economic reality. Russia's economy is on a war footing. Sanctions have hurt, but they haven't crippled Moscow. The Kremlin has found workarounds through China, India, Turkey, and the UAE to keep its economy afloat. Meanwhile, Europe is paying the price. Energy costs are still high, inflation remains stubborn, and European industries are struggling to compete with cheaper, Russian-backed competitors. The longer this war goes on, the more Europe suffers. Third, the political reality. The US is entering an election year, and Ukraine is becoming a political football. Donald Trump has already signaled that he would push for a quick end to the war if he wins in November. Even if Biden holds on, the American public's appetite for endless funding is waning. A recent poll found that only 41% of Americans support continuing military aid to Ukraine at current levels. That's a problem for Kyiv, because without US support, Ukraine collapses. So where does that leave us? Let's consider the scenarios. The best-case scenario, from a Western perspective, is that Ukraine holds the line, Russia exhausts itself, and a negotiated settlement is reached that preserves most of Ukraine's territory. But even this outcome is unlikely. Russia has no incentive to negotiate unless it gets something in return. And right now, it's winning. Why would Putin settle for less than what he's already taken? The most likely scenario is a frozen conflict. The front lines stabilize, Ukraine becomes a de facto partition state, and the war drags on for years, like Korea in the 1950s or Cyprus in the 1970s. This is the outcome that Russia wants. It gives Moscow time to consolidate its gains, rebuild its military, and wait for Western resolve to crumble. It's also the outcome that would be most damaging to the US and NATO, because it would signal that the West's security guarantees are worthless. The worst-case scenario is a full-scale Russian breakthrough. If Ukraine's defenses collapse, and they might, if Western aid dries up, Russia could push deeper into Ukraine, potentially taking Odessa or even Kyiv. That would be a disaster for Europe, triggering a refugee crisis and potentially drawing NATO into direct conflict with Russia. It's unlikely, but not impossible. Now, let me be clear about something. None of these scenarios are good. But the idea that Ukraine can win a decisive victory, that Russia can be forced to retreat to its 1991 borders, is a fantasy. It's the kind of thinking that got us into Iraq and Afghanistan, where we assumed that superior firepower and moral righteousness would guarantee victory. We were wrong then, and we're wrong now. So what should we do instead? First, we need to accept reality. Russia is not going to give back the territory it has taken. The longer we pretend otherwise, the more Ukrainians will die for a lost cause. That doesn't mean we abandon Ukraine. It means we negotiate from a position of strength, not delusion. Second, we need to rethink our grand strategy. The US cannot afford to fight a two-front war against Russia in Europe and China in the Pacific. We need to prioritize. And right now, China is the bigger threat. That means finding a way to extricate ourselves from Ukraine without looking weak. It means working with allies to contain Russia, not provoke it. And it means accepting that the world is no longer unipolar. We're entering an era of great power competition, and we need to adjust accordingly. Third, we need to stop pretending that this war is about democracy versus autocracy. It's not. It's about power. Russia invaded Ukraine because it saw an opportunity to weaken NATO and secure its strategic interests. The US and Europe are supporting Ukraine because they see an opportunity to weaken Russia. That's how great powers operate. We can lament the cynicism of it all, but we can't ignore it. Finally, we need to have an honest conversation about what victory looks like. If the goal is to preserve Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state, then we need to define what that means in practical terms. Does it mean a neutral Ukraine outside of NATO? Does it mean a federated Ukraine, with some regions under Russian control? Does it mean a long-term US security guarantee, like the one we gave to South Korea? These are hard questions, but we can't keep kicking the can down the road. The bottom line is Putin's red lines have hardened. He's not bluffing. And if we keep pushing, we're going to find out just how far he's willing to go. The time for wishful thinking is over. The time for hard choices is here. I've spent my career warning about the dangers of strategic overreach. I've seen what happens when great powers ignore the limits of their power. And I'm telling you, we are on a collision course with disaster. The question is whether we have the wisdom to change course before it's too late. The choice is ours. But time is running out. Now, what most people don't realize is that we've been here before many times, in fact. The pattern is as old as statecraft itself. When a declining hegemon refuses to accept the rise of a rival, it doubles down on containment, provocation, and ultimately, war. We saw it with Athens and Sparta, Rome and Carthage, Britain and Germany. And now we're seeing it with Washington and Moscow. The difference this time? The stakes are existential in a way they haven't been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me explain why this matters. The Biden administration and much of the foreign policy establishment has convinced itself that Russia is a paper tiger, that Putin is a cornered dictator lashing out, and that economic sanctions and military aid will eventually force a Russian collapse. This is not just wrong, it's dangerously naive. The Russian economy has not collapsed. In fact, it's grown by 3.6% in 2023, outpacing every G7 nation except the United States. Defense production has surged. Russia is now producing more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined. And while Western elites obsess over Russian casualties, they ignore the fact that Russia has mobilized its society for total war in a way we haven't seen since 1945. The Russian people are not revolting. They're adapting. Here's the uncomfortable: we are not winning this war. We are not even close. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the worse it gets. Take the much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive last summer. The Pentagon and NATO spent months hyping it as the decisive blow that would break Russian lines. What actually happened? After 6 months of brutal fighting, Ukraine lost over 70,000 men and gained, at best, 200 square kilometers of territory. That's not a counteroffensive. That's a meat grinder. And yet, the narrative in Washington and Brussels remains: just one more push, just a few more HIMARS, just a little more time, and victory will be ours. This is strategic malpractice. And it's not just the politicians. The media has played its part, too. Remember when the New York Times ran that front-page story in August 2022 claiming that Russian morale was collapsing, that soldiers were deserting en masse, that the war was a quagmire? That was 2 years ago. Where's the collapse? Where's the quagmire? The truth is, the Russian military has learned, adapted, and improved. It's not the same force that bungled the initial invasion. It's now a hardened, battle-tested army fighting on interior lines with superior firepower and manpower. And it's not going anywhere. Now, let's talk about the nuclear elephant in the room. The establishment likes to dismiss Putin's nuclear threats as bluster, as psychological warfare. But that's a mistake. In October 2022, Putin explicitly warned that Russia would use all available means to defend its territory, including newly annexed regions. That wasn't an offhand remark. It was a red line. And yet, we've spent the last 2 years testing it, arming Ukraine with long-range missiles, training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s, and now openly discussing the possibility of sending NATO troops. Each of these steps brings us closer to direct conflict. And each time, Putin has responded with escalation, not retreat. Remember the Kerch Strait incident in 2018? When Ukrainian naval vessels tried to force their way into the Sea of Azov, Russia didn't hesitate. It opened fire, seized the ships, and arrested the crews. That was a warning. Then came the 2021 buildup, when Russia massed 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border and demanded security guarantees. We ignored it. Then came the invasion. Then came the annexations. Then came the nuclear threats. At what point do we stop pretending that Putin is bluffing? Here's another inconvenient: the West has no coherent endgame. The official line is that Ukraine must regain all its territory, including Crimea. But that's a fantasy. Crimea has been Russian since 2014. Its population is overwhelmingly pro-Russian. The Black Sea Fleet is based there. And after a decade of Russian investment, it's now a fortress. The idea that Ukraine, even with NATO backing, could retake Crimea without triggering a wider war is delusional. And yet, we keep feeding this illusion, pouring billions into a war that cannot be won on the battlefield. Let me be, I'm not saying Ukraine should surrender. I'm saying we need to be honest about what's possible. The alternative is a forever war, one that drains American resources, weakens our position in the Pacific, and risks a direct NATO-Russia conflict. That's not a strategy. That's a death spiral. Now, some will say, Macgregor, you're advocating for appeasement. No. I'm advocating for realism. The last time the West tried to force regime change in Moscow, it ended in disaster. Remember the Russian Civil War? When the US, Britain, France, and Japan intervened to support the whites against the Bolsheviks? It failed. Spectacularly. And it left a legacy of mistrust that lasted decades. We're repeating the same mistake, but this time with nuclear weapons. The hard truth is that Russia is not going to disappear. It's not going to collapse. And it's not going to accept defeat. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we can start thinking about how to manage this rivalry without stumbling into Armageddon. That means diplomacy. That means compromise. And yes, that means accepting that some of Putin's red lines are non-negotiable. The question is whether we have the courage to face reality before it's too late. Because right now, we're sleepwalking into a catastrophe. And the clock is ticking. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the fundamental reordering of global power, and we're watching it happen in real time, like a slow-motion train wreck where no one in the control room has the guts to pull the emergency brake. The establishment keeps telling us this is a battle between democracy and autocracy, good versus evil, as if we're still living in the 1990s when the rules of the game were written in Washington. But the world has moved on. The unipolar moment is over, and the sooner we accept that, the less painful the transition will be. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. Russia isn't acting in a vacuum. Every move Putin makes is calculated not just against Ukraine, but against the broader Western alliance. And here's the uncomfortable: he's winning. Not on the battlefield, at least, not decisively, but in the war of endurance. The longer this drags on, the more the cracks in NATO's unity become visible. Look at Hungary, which has been quietly sabotaging EU sanctions for months. Look at Slovakia, where Robert Fico just won an election on a platform of ending military support for Ukraine. Even in Germany, the political class is fracturing. Scholz's government is hanging by a thread, and the far-right Alternative for Deutschland is surging in the polls, in part because of public exhaustion with the war. This isn't some fringe phenomenon. It's the beginning of a continental realignment. And then there's the military reality. The West keeps talking about Ukraine's counteroffensive as if it's a foregone conclusion that they'll break through Russian lines. But let's look at the numbers. In 2022, Ukraine had the element of surprise, fresh Western equipment, and a Russian military still reeling from its initial blunders. Today, the Russians have dug in. They've built layered defenses stretching back 20 kilometers in some places, complete with minefields, dragon's teeth, and pre-sighted artillery. They've adapted their tactics, shifting from massed armor assaults to smaller, more mobile units supported by drones and electronic warfare. And they've done this while maintaining a steady flow of manpower. The Wagner mutiny in June was a hiccup, not a collapse. The Russian military has absorbed the lessons of the past 18 months, and it's now a far more formidable force than it was at the start of the war. Meanwhile, Ukraine is running out of men. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40. The mobilization laws are deeply unpopular, and desertions are rising. The much-touted counteroffensive has stalled, with Ukrainian forces taking heavy casualties for minimal gains. The US and NATO keep promising F-16s, long-range missiles, and more artillery, but these are band-aids on a gaping wound. The fundamental problem is that Ukraine cannot sustain this war indefinitely. Russia can. And that's before we even get to the nuclear question. Here's where the establishment's narrative completely breaks down. They keep insisting that Putin would never use tactical nukes because it would be irrational. But that's the same kind of thinking that led us to believe he'd never invade Ukraine in the first place. The fact is, Putin has already crossed every other red line we thought he wouldn't. He's annexed territory. He's threatened NATO members. He's weaponized energy and food supplies. And he's done all of this while the West's response has been, at best, incremental. So why would he stop at nukes? The doctrine is if Russia faces an existential threat, it reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first. And if Ukraine, with Western backing, starts making real progress toward Crimea or the Donbass, that's exactly how Putin will frame it. Now, I'm not saying he'll nuke Kiev tomorrow. But I am saying that the risk of escalation is far higher than our leaders are willing to admit. And here's the West has no plan for what happens if he does. Do we retaliate with our own nukes? Do we launch a conventional strike on Russian soil? Do we do nothing and risk looking weak? None of these are good options. And that's the Putin knows we're paralyzed by our own contradictions. We want to support Ukraine, but we don't want to risk World War III. We want to weaken Russia, but we don't want to push Putin into a corner where he feels he has nothing to lose. So we dither. We send just enough weapons to keep the war going, but not enough to win it. And in the meantime, the clock keeps ticking. Let's talk about the bigger picture for a moment. This war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of Europe's security architecture. For decades, NATO has operated under the assumption that Russia could be contained, that it would eventually collapse under the weight of its own inefficiencies, or that it would be forced to accept Western hegemony. That assumption is dead. Russia has proven that it can withstand sanctions, that it can mobilize its economy for war, and that it can project power far beyond its borders. And it's not alone. China is watching closely. Iran is supplying drones. North Korea is sending artillery shells. The axis of revisionist powers is coalescing, and they're all learning the same: the West's resolve is weaker than it looks. So where does that leave us? If we're honest, it leaves us in a world where the old rules no longer apply. The idea that NATO can EXD indefinitely without consequence is finished. The notion that the US can pivot to Asia while Europe handles its own security is a fantasy. And the belief that we can force Russia to accept defeat without risking a catastrophic escalation is delusional. The only way out of this mess is through diplomacy, but not the kind of diplomacy we've seen so far. The West has to accept that some of Russia's demands are non-negotiable. That means acknowledging that Ukraine will never be a full member of NATO. It means accepting that Crimea and parts of the Donbass are, for all practical purposes, lost. And it means offering Russia a face-saving off-ramp, something that allows Putin to claim victory without humiliating him. I know how this sounds. I know the establishment will call it surrender. But this isn't about surrender. It's about survival. The alternative is a war that drags on for years, that drains Western resources, that weakens our position against China, and that risks a direct NATO-Russia conflict. And for what? To restore the borders of a country that, let's be honest, was never a functioning democracy even before the war? To prove a point about Western resolve? To satisfy the moral vanity of politicians who will never have to fight in the trenches? History doesn't reward moral vanity. It rewards those who understand power. And right now, the West is losing its grip on power because it refuses to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The longer we cling to the illusion that Ukraine can win a total victory, the worse the eventual reckoning will be. Because one way or another, this war is going to end. The only question is whether it ends with a negotiated settlement or with a bang. And I, for one, would prefer the former.